Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 3 of our meta-analysis course. Just to briefly recap what we've accomplished so far this semester, we began by discussing what is a meta-analysis, distinguishing it from other literature reviews. We discussed the history of meta-analysis, went over some of the mechanics of how a meta-analysis might work. We discussed some of the benefits to performing a meta-analysis, and as well as just having a brief discussion about what an effect size is. Moving on to Module 2, which you should be completing this week as I'm doing this recording. You had some readings that basically outlined how one might develop an idea for conducting a meta-analysis and formulating a problem and hypotheses to be tested by doing a meta-analytic review. Provided two examples of recent meta-analyses of mine that have been published to give you all an idea of what a finished meta-analysis might look like. Module 3 will discuss how to conduct a thorough systematic search. I've provided 4 readings to help accomplish this. I will give you all about 2 weeks to get started on your systematic search. Some of you might need less time, others might need more time. After that point, I would like to move on to discuss how to code a primary study, and if you have not completed your systematic search by that point, that's okay. You'll still, though, be able to begin to understand how we might evaluate whether or not a study should be included in our meta-analysis, and how we might basically record our data. So now we'll discuss the data collection and retrieval of studies. I'd like to give a brief acknowledgement to Mike McDaniel and Hannah Rothstein for the use of their slides. So in this instance, we'll be discussing how to systematically search the literature and then ultimately retrieve the studies that we have identified. So those are the 2 key concepts that we'll discuss today. This is an example of a description of a thorough systematic search that was published in one of the top management journals, Journal of Applied Psychology, in 2007. This is an example of a poor documentation of a systematic search. The writers basically say that they conducted a thorough search of the organizational citizenship behavior literature. They used a number of databases. They give 2 examples here, and then they said they examined a reference list of previous reviews. Well, one of the benefits with doing a meta-analysis in a systematic search is that it's supposed to be ultimately explicit, transparent, and easily replicated. This, unfortunately, is not a good example. For example, we don't know what types of search terms they used. We don't know what journals they might have looked at specifically. We don't know if they ever were able to identify published compared to unpublished samples, and so forth. This is another example published in the same journal from 2006, and this is by a different set of researchers, and you can see here, I won't go through and read the description in this case, but you can see the level of detail and why this might be a systematic search that is considered to be more explicit, more easily replicated. So ultimately what you're trying to do is conduct a comprehensive search, something that's very thorough. So you want to look in all domains. You don't want to be restricted by language. You want to have a representative sample of both unpublished and published literature, and you also want your systematic search to be up to date. So you don't want to be restricted by the years. You don't want to be limited to more recent studies and not look at older studies. You also want to make sure you have access to the most recent studies. And ultimately, you want to be able to document your search so that others can replicate it in the future, and so that you can answer any questions reviewers might have or authors might have, and eliminate any concerns that they might have that your search was not comprehensive. Alright, so I think that this is a very important concept because you can't introduce bias into your meta-analytic review if your search is not systematic, if it is not comprehensive. And so you can see here that we've written the validity of the results of a meta-analytic review is threatened no matter how systematic and thorough in other respects if the retrieval of these studies is biased in some capacity. So to conduct a good, thorough, systematic search, it's very important to have appropriate search terms. You can understand how if you had poor search terms, perhaps you might miss You might miss some studies. It's valuable to search in multiple databases. Oftentimes there is overlap, but there is oftentimes not perfect overlap. Therefore, it's beneficial to look in multiple areas. It's valuable to do manual searches as well as electronic searches. It's important to include gray literature. This could include basically unpublished literature such as dissertations, conference papers, completely unpublished papers. You might be able to think of other sources as well. And then also, again, it's important to document what has been searched and how it's been searched. And that this is also useful for your own purposes as well, so that you're not repeating steps at any point in your search process. All right, so there are a couple of different ways in which you can keep track of what you've accomplished. Some have suggested keeping different types of lists, or you can have the same list and have different categories. But basically, you're looking at these 4 general categories. So studies that you are currently looking for, you've identified that they exist, but you're trying to obtain them. So you perhaps may want to consider where you have looked for them, what databases, have you submitted interlibrary loans. You also have studies that perhaps you have physically, but you have not had a chance to review them or look at them yet. You will oftentimes have many studies that you have been able to obtain, but you have noticed that you're unable to use them. And then finally, you'll have a category of studies that you have identified and obtained, and you have identified that they're useful. So some strategies for finding all the literature. I oftentimes recommend using some sort of bibliographic software. I, for example, use EndNote. This is a picture of what EndNote looks like. EndNote is very useful because you can oftentimes go to places like Google Scholar, EBSCOhost, and other places and export references immediately into them. You can see here that you can make subcategories depending on what your topics are. So this is a valuable way to track and record what it is that you've identified. And the larger your systematic search, the more literature you identify, the more likely you are to need bibliographic software. If you're doing a smaller search, in the sense that you're less likely to identify a large number of studies, in that instance you might be able to get by with just manually recording information in Excel. This is just an example of a rough estimate of what your list of identified studies might look like. A very small portion of studies you are perhaps trying to locate but haven't been able to obtain yet. You'll also have typically in your possession a small percentage of data that are actually useful. So for example, if you identify 1,000 potential studies in your systematic search, perhaps only 100 of them are actually useful. So that is certainly not uncommon at all. Thus you'll have perhaps another 89% hypothetically that you identified, you obtained, but they're not useful data there. And then ultimately one list disappears because you've moved everything into the other 3 categories. Next you get to the point of study selection, and we'll discuss this a little bit more 2 weeks from now when we get into Module 4 and we start discussing evaluating studies for inclusion. But it is important to at least have this in the back of your mind when you're beginning your systematic search. So you want to have studies that are selected based on a predetermined criteria. So for example, in management research, I'm typically interested in normal working adults. So if I do a research study that includes looking in psychology journals, I might decide to exclude abnormal adults because I want my results to generalize to the normal working population. So that would be a criteria for selection that I would set in advance and then use that to take into consideration when I'm deciding what would I ultimately include in my meta-analysis. And this can also help you when you're basically going through your various lists of studies. It's helpful to have multiple people evaluate the study quality and then also to code it. You can calculate inter-rater reliability to make sure that you're doing this reliably, of course, and with consistency. And it's important to keep detailed notes So oftentimes I will record in an Excel file. If we decide not to use the study, I will say we decided not to use the study, and I'll make a simple note. Even if it's something like this study was a qualitative study or it was just a theoretical study, I would write that down because if it ever comes up, why was this study not included, I could go back to my notes and I have an understanding as to why I decided to exclude it. Alright, so when you're looking at ways in which to retrieve studies, it's important to consider the scope of the search, so which disciplines should be searched in. If, for example, you're doing a study on the relationship between pay and job performance, or performance of some capacity, you might not want to look just in psychology and management journals. You might want to also look in economic journals, for example. Or you can imagine another instance where there's overlap between psychology and sociology, where there's overlap between education and management. So it's important to not just look within your own discipline, but to look in other disciplines. You might consider what tools do you have as far as indexing. You might look at format for ways in which you can index. You might want to consider how far back does the indexing go, what languages might be indexed. Is it possible to locate non-English material? So can you translate your search terms into Spanish, French, Chinese, so forth? And then how can you access unpublished sources of literature such as dissertations, conference papers, so forth? I often recommend, as far as a beginning point, looking in electronic databases. There are numerous ones that I recommend. And again, it does depend on the types of studies you're looking for. These are just some examples here. But I oftentimes, when I'm searching here at Longwood, I'll go and I'll look at the Greenwood Library, and I'll go over to databases. One of my favorite places to look in is ABI Inform. I also like looking within Google Scholar. Google Scholar is easily one of the most comprehensive ways to obtain unpublished studies. ERIC is another good one. I don't believe we have access to either EBSCOhost. There's another one, not that EBSCOhost. And there's also the Social Science Citation Index. I don't think we have access to either of these at Longwood, but if you're working with a colleague who's at another university, those are two excellent databases to look in as well. Alright, so when you're preparing your search, it's important to think about what concepts, what key terms to use, how have they been operationalized and defined, how are they represented in each field. There are numerous things that you can do as well beyond looking at just electronic databases. So I recommend hand searching key journals, looking within conference proceedings. You can go through reference lists of studies. So when you find a study that meets your description, you can go through their reference lists and basically look to see who they're citing. You can also go and look at who, if you find a key study, who has cited that key study. So Google Scholar, for example, has that feature. You can type in the list or the title of the journal, bring it up, and then you can see who cited it since then. I always recommend contacting researchers. I would email individual researchers who are known to have conducted research in that topic. You can also send out a call for unpublished papers over email listservs. I recommend doing these latter two steps when you are much closer to completion. If you're at a point where you're getting ready to submit your paper or finish your analyses and write-up, that's a good time to do it. Once you start contacting people and letting them know that you are doing meta-analysis on this topic, you leave yourself vulnerable to getting scooped by someone who's potentially competing with you and doing a similar study. That's why you kind of want to wait until you're at a more advanced stage. Research registries are a good place to look, and just the regular internet in general. Most fields in the social sciences don't have good research registries, but it is worth investigating to see if such registries exist. Alright, so this is a basic introduction to how to conduct a systematic search. If anyone has questions, I'm certainly available in my office. We can schedule a meeting to discuss specific search terms or databases that you might want to look in. So please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks.